Today on our Tech for Business podcast, we're joined by Anne, our quality assurance analyst, to discuss AI policy. I think we're all so excited about AI. Sometimes we forget that policy is so much more important to get into place first. And maybe you can start us off about what does AI mean in the context of policy?
It really is kind of as we're trying to generate something that an organization would use as a guide. AI is really referring to a type of technology.
Yeah.
So when I'm describing how it is a new-ish thing, and it's really certainly a buzzword. It's everyone wants to use it somehow. And we do want to embrace it, but it's really kind of a type of technology that we want to that uses learning. And this is a perfect question because it does kind of lead into where our discussion will go, because that is one of the first and foremost things that you want to put your arm around as you're developing a policy for your organization is, what does that mean to you? Is this a certain type of AI? Is it the way that AI operates? Or is it there's machine learning models, there's generative tools. What does that mean for you? And that there's a lot of definitions. Clearly, artificial intelligence can mean anything from, pre-2000 movies to an alien invasion in the future. But really, it is that technology that embraces the systems learning and can perform tasks, gather data, analyze data, that really seems more human in nature.
So it sounds like the definition for a company could be different for everyone.
It absolutely could be. It really, I think one of the pieces to think about first is where that definition is, but that kind of then starts rolling into the next piece that I recommend for the policy, and that's where you're defining your scope. What does this entity called AI, whatever that looks like for your organization, look like, and where are the bumpers and or the guardrails? And the scope definitely is where that gets kind of reined in a little bit. That scope would be much different for, say, a healthcare organization than CIT.
Sure, for sure. I'm going a little off the rails because my question is, who defines that? If it's important to have a definition, who gets to decide what that is?
I would say, usually there's one or two people, and this will be towards the end of our discussion maybe, but I love how you're thinking because, I operate like that all over. It's always going to be a collaborative effort, and that is true of your policies in general. You don't want to ever create a policy in a bubble. When we have opportunity to work with our customers to develop policies for them, we always say this has to be a collaborative effort, because you know your business more than I do. Our leadership knows different elements of the business better than I do. Where should we be if we're taking this right back to AI? Where should those guardrails be? What should the scope be? Maybe I know about the compliance pieces, but I may not know how this gets used in development. And that our current AI policy actually addressed part of that. And we had a really thoughtful discussion with the team to say, this is where we would probably use it. Okay, let's move this. Let's move the rails a little bit. Let's guide it. Maybe we do have some forks in the road and divisions of understanding. But it really, in my opinion, has to be collaborative. Will you always have a entity that has to sometimes make the rules and say, sorry, it has to be like that? Of course.
Yeah.
But with that collaborative effort, it makes that communication that much easier.
Yeah. So just like other policies, this could kind of ebb and flow within reason, depending on how employees or departments need to use it, I imagine.
Yep, it absolutely did. And we had generated just from our own experience, we had generated an AI policy about 2 years ago, and using the example that I hadn't really even thought of, but someone from our dev team came and said, could we be using this? I want to understand how we could be. And I'm like, absolutely. Let's just figure out how we can control the information. We always, of course, I'm in that compliance headspace. I want
Yes.
everyone to make sure our information, our customers' information is reasonably protected the way it needs to be. And that's where we want to put in those bumpers to say, this is what we should do. These are the tools. Ours is kind of guided in understanding what we define and want to know about how AI learns. And because it's important, we have really smart people that work for us. And it's really neat to be able to have people read it and understand, to say, oh, that makes sense. Where maybe those words in a healthcare organization might not be the same guide that would be used.
For sure. So on that same vein of, different departments are using this, AI and looking at this policy differently. What does effective communication look like? Because everyone needs to know about the policy, whether you are using AI or not. You need to know that there is a policy out there just in case you start using it.
Right.
So what does that look like for a company?
I say with both policy and training, early and often. I'm sure our internal team gets a little overwhelmed with the great amount of training we have. I really don't think it's a huge amount. I think we avoid the hours that many have once a year by breaking it up over a lot of time. But showing the importance, this goes back to the collaborative effort to say, we're going to define this. We'll have training on what that looks like. And then that the ongoing awareness, should there be updates to this, we want to re-communicate our policies. We want to say what this means, what we should do, what we shouldn't do, what the expectations are of resources available, and also any repercussions for misuse. And if no one likes to talk about that part, but that's in every policy. You have to have something to say, this is what we should be doing, and we have an understanding, but your malicious intent in going around the controls is really where you line up and say, that's not an acceptable use.
Definitely. So I want to make sure that we're covering all of the topics that you want to talk about today. But when we're creating a policy, as a company, we want to consider those like ethical considerations. How does that play a role in creating this AI policy? What should we really be aware of?
There is a lot that
Yeah.
goes into that ethical use. And I use that with quotes for someone just listening. And the quotes don't mean that there is a delusion that it shouldn't be ethical. It means there's a lot of tentacles to that word. That means the ethical use will require an understanding of biases that might be built into your searches. That's understanding that there could be a reputational risk to what you're using your AI for, making sure there's transparency. We never put a policy up at CIT and say, oh, it's been there, without expecting people and given the opportunity to say, we need you to read and understand. And if you have questions, we want to know. We want to have that discussion, and we want to understand where there might be concerns. I think those are are much more prevalent at an organization that does have more regulatory frameworks. But I don't think that really changes, in my opinion, to say this is what we want to make sure isn't happening. How
Right.
do we put those bumpers on if you have an ethical concern about something that you would be trying to use AI for? Let's talk about it before you do it. Let's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
I know it's pretty easy in going, but making sure a easy thing to be aware of is making sure you're not violating any sort of copyright
Yeah.
in doing an easy search. I know this seems really silly, but I did use the AI to do our trivia, which was super fun, and I had a ton of time, but I looked into what the allowed both ethical and regulatory use of sound bites, because
Oh,
I wanted to
sure.
make sure that we were doing the right thing. How are you authorized to do it? How are you not? What
Hmm.
are the parameters around those? And it makes it a little bit more difficult, but throughout this discussion, we will be kind of addressing this. One of the things that AI will not ever replace is the human element.
Hmm.
And I think that it's really easy for someone to say, I don't know, that it does your work for you. We're going to be eliminated. But there is also always going to be the requirement for someone to look through and understand, not just pull the words. It's like pulling a requirements document or one of our manuals that we're required to support our customers that has all the frameworks and controls. Just because we have them doesn't mean they're understood. So we can pull all the data, but there still has to be human intervention to look at what the results yield.
Hmm.
I could have pulled all the rules, which I did, but I still had to read them and understand where we had to divide, and even in the way we cut the sound bites to
Yeah,
make sure we're
definitely.
doing it right. So
We had a different podcast where we were talking about creating AI agents, and
mhm,
we had such an interesting discussion about like there is a line at which the agent needs to stop and the human needs to come back in. AI
absolutely.
is not going to take your job. We're not at that,
No.
point. You really do still need that human person to make some of those bigger decisions.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
for sure.
really is. That just to kind of come full circle with that ethical, there are a lot of rules and controls about, say, healthcare
Mhm.
and PII, PHI, that kind of controlled data
Mhm.
that everyone needs to be aware separate and in parallel with
Yeah.
any AI agent. There are some pretty magical things happening using AI and in the medical field. That still doesn't mean we can't we need a human to look at these results to see if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to you mentioned very quickly about transparency, and I would love
Mhm,
to just dive into that a little bit
mhm.
deeper because, you know, what does that mean internally versus externally? I mean, what does transparency mean for a company when it comes to AI use and AI policies?
I also multifaceted.
Yes, that's a big question. That is
There's
a
tentacles for
huge question.
transparency. I think from the start, if we're talking about the generation of the policy, is making it clear what we do and do not tolerate at a base level, what we do or do not use this for, what we allow it to be used for, where those guides stop and start, communicating outside of the organization or even internally to say we are using a tool with
Mhm.
AI to generate these. and it should, like our one of our upcoming tools will eliminate very low level functions in some of the questions and repeat questions that we get to some of our teams. And I see that as an opportunity where we kind of touched on the idea that some people feel like AI will take over their job, but in reality, now I have that really low level function somewhat eliminated or answered, and our really super bright and awesome team can now dig into the more difficult things and have an opportunity to shine.
Yeah.
I think of something like a password reset, and like I know that that's a low hanging fruit and some people might like to do that, but our team is really great, and I think that it's really giving people an opportunity to see just how awesome we are when that the basic functions are kind of covered. Again, that doesn't mean that they do them.
Right.
It still requires it's a more easy direction to say the operation to get it to the right person at the right time or the right resource. But that's just a few of the decision trees that are kind of eliminated out of that, and allowing people to really dig in. So that's the transparency element, to say we're not, that's the internal communication. We're not trying to take anyone's job. We're absolutely trying to give all of us an opportunity to evaluate, shine, look at the bigger issues and come up with better, more efficient operation.
Yeah. I think off air in a different conversation, we were saying, if you've ever wanted an intern, that's kind of what these AI agents and things can do, these tools, to a certain extent. You know, they can't do everything like we mentioned. But if there was ever a moment where you're like, oh, I wish somebody could answer my emails or like look through my stuff or just do this very simple task that I just don't have time for, that's really a great place to start with AI.
It is, absolutely. And I say this with the intention. I have asked many, quite a few people we've talked with about what the implication of using AI to generate your policies. I'm like, you will get what you might consider a template.
Yeah.
And you should take that template, let it sink in, evaluate it.
Yeah.
But in a lot of ways, AI can get you like 50% or even 75% of the meat and potatoes of, say, a policy. Even with citations. That is something I did with a health policy that I needed to write. I actually generated the policy, and it was long. It felt like a term paper in, they don't even call them term papers anymore, but a term paper in college. But I went in to say, let's apply the citations from the security manual, like at HSA. And it did. And I obviously evaluated them to make sure, but I'm like, do you know how long a list of resources take in the right format and all the, it's so gross.
Yeah.
And then I only had to check it to make sure it was accurate. It was so great.
Yes.
But that's the checking the links that it brought back. And none of it was proprietary in nature. It was all publicly available things to insert in something that we can all come to use as policies across the board. So
for sure,
it is kind of eliminating, not eliminating, but there is that, and I'm learning this. All of my opportunities to learn more about AI have really been on how we scope, how we ask, how we generate the prompts, and that is a whole learning curve in and of itself, but it's really fascinating. It's
Yeah. Oh,
it's
yeah.
getting to the right uh yeah, getting to the right end with a little more meat to the detail that we add.
For sure. So we're talking policy, and how anyone who's using AI, and even if you're not using AI, should have an AI policy of some sort because it's coming down the line. Can you talk a little bit about, especially healthcare and finance? Are there any big entities that are dealing with AI in their compliance? Like when we're talking about regulation, who is sort of, how do I ask, you know, um,
We could
asking for those?
definitely
Yeah.
we could definitely include the links in the podcast if it would be helpful, but there are two right now, one specific to healthcare and one to finance.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I wouldn't say it's a Dr. Seuss book, but it's kind of AI and healthcare. It's
Yeah.
pretty, how is it being used? What are the
Sure.
recommendations right now? Same with banking. The power in say banking, healthcare is a little bit different because it depends on how it's being used, obviously. Not to
Right.
quote Todd,
I know.
it depends, but it really is neat in finance or in the financial sector. The idea of reporting or
Hmm.
guided reporting within the data that you have, setting those guides, what can or can't you use it for, who can use it. Um,
Hmm.
it depends on your role, but it might and really could just make that much more benefit to you. The calculations that have taken a really long time or a place to be able to guide you for future forecasting or things like that. That's that's where this is really going to help. It doesn't take the human away again.
Hmm.
They're taking the data they get and still analyzing and still
Yeah.
putting their input in. But no, the two I can find the links, but
Yeah.
they're
We'll make sure
pretty
they're in them.
straightforward, and I actually pretty I enjoyed reading them, and I'm a nerd like that. But it just to put guardrails on, what are we using it for? What shouldn't we?
For sure.
That's mhm.
Hmm. We covered a couple of the big concerns or some risks of AI. Are there any? I'm trying to think. Privacy in data is a huge one that we haven't touched on. Any over reliance maybe on AI? Are there any big concerns that come to mind for you when we're talking about AI use?
I over reliance can definitely
Hmm.
be a concern. I think personally that it's not necessarily the over reliance, it's the lack of checking
Mm.
when
Yeah.
I know that's really broad, but
Yeah.
when you're coming up with something, and I was truly, I said, make an infographic out of the recommended AI policy concerns.
Hmm.
And it did, but without that second, if I'm becoming too comfortable and using being too reliant, I'm not checking my work. There were spelling errors in it. There were,
Hmm.
if I were to just push off the results as fact, there would be a
Hmm.
lot of issues
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. It kind of comes back to that transparency. You
Yep.
can't just rely on that AI doing it. You have to be able, because anyone internally or externally could come back and say, what does this mean? And even though AI created it, you still have to be able to say, this is what this means. This is how we got here.
Yep.
That is so important to have built
Yep.
into your system.
Absolutely. I say that loosely with the citations. I know about where
Yes.
those things are, and
Yes.
in some policies, it is important to say this is where we derived this requirement.
Mm-hmm.
But without checking that, I need to make sure that's what it actually went
Yeah.
to.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
For sure. Well, we talked really broadly about AI policy, and I want to get a little bit more into kind of the meat and potatoes of it. So if a company is just starting, again, I think in the past we've mentioned everyone should have an AI policy, even if it simply just says we don't do it, that's fine. But where should a company start? If there's all these people, there's all these departments, how do you even start with creating an AI policy?
I think that that is not unlike any new policy that is going to be, first of all, collaborative. Like I
Mhm.
mentioned before, we want to get those together that
Yes.
would be both impacting, using, reliant on a new
Mhm.
tool. And I really try to look at AI as a tool when I'm talking about it, using it, making a policy about it, because we would do the same thing for a new application. We want to
Mhm.
evaluate it. We want to put the security controls on it that are appropriate. We want to be able to use it for the best possible purposes too.
Yeah.
I despite the compliance moniker, I always strive to be able to use the tools we come up with with the guardrails.
Mhm.
I never want to say no, but I want to say yes, but.
Yeah.
And we need to understand and know. So that first step is kind of really where we started today. We want to
Mhm.
define what AI means for us. Does that mean it's a very small organization and the intent is to use a chat GPT, or the rewrite one is eluding me right now. The It's not Wordle. It's something, uh, but to see what tools would be beneficial. So that's the first kind of parameter. And then saying, but we don't want you to put, and it is prohibited from putting company data in
Mhm.
ChatGPT in the public sector. And seeing what you want to do, put
Mhm.
that scope around it, saying what you shouldn't do, and the positive actions, and then walking through how the hat happens. I don't think it's ever fair to fully prohibit something without a maybe a why, but also, but then what? We're
Mhm.
not going to totally prohibit you from using something, but this is what you could use instead, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. So
Yeah.
I'm just saying it like using a big, like, we don't want you to use Chat GPT for this reason, but we want you to use Copilot for this reason. And
Yeah.
that's really that's very broad and very big, kind of
Mhm.
swiping, but really that's where you want to look into it and say this AI resources is great for the dev team.
Mhm.
There's no reason for me to use it at all.
Right. Right.
And by doing that, you have those the whys, the understanding that's making it more transparent and explainable to
Mhm.
all the team members that would be using it. Some people really won't and don't have any interest. I don't know why, but like I said, I want to encourage people to use some sort of tool like this, but with those guiding principles to say, we're not going to do this, but we should do this. And please do use this because it's an awesome resource for you to get 50% of your low hanging fruit, kind of like the intern,
Yeah.
to deliver a half a report that you really didn't want to get started, but here it is half done. You need to put your expertise into it, and then having the ability to communicate that with all of that collaborative effort and buy-in. That's
Mhm.
that's where I I think it's pretty easy. I know it's a lot of it seems like a lot of work. You have to like generate who you want on that team. But I think most organizations have someone or someones that
Mhm.
do their policies or communicate policies. And then with that effort, being able to scope it, you have your guide to bring to people. And that's where you have that training and education and where this would go from there. Here, ask questions. We want those questions. Maybe some,
Definitely.
but I do. I always say that with even our acceptable use policy. If there's something that doesn't seem reasonable, I want to know about it.
Yeah. So, are there any missteps that you see people take when they're creating a policy or things that they forget about? What are those blind spots, if you will, when creating a policy or specifically an AI policy?
Developing any policy in a bubble, in
Mhm.
my opinion, is one of the first and biggest missteps. Then it's
Yeah.
almost like having your own personal mortgage with all the interest rates and payment due dates, and it's only sitting on your file share and nobody else in your family or even at work or whatever the case may be knows anything about it.
Mm,
And expecting those two, that it's important that they know and understand about it.
yeah,
That is the biggest.
for sure. And then what are some of those really important foundational elements? Like you cannot forget about X, Y, and Z for this policy.
I think we've talked about the scope and
Hmm.
defining it, really understanding the ethical principles. I think that a lot of people, and I find even that, and we mentioned it before, but I know that some people might even find the idea of feeling that like they may be replaced by an AI tool under an ethical principle too. But we want to make sure, besides the transparency and accountability and understanding those privacy, that it's real and we understand all of those ethical elements. And I've done a search several times on what are the ethical elements to be concerned
Hmm.
with an AI policy, but there's always a lot of overlap to me in there's a different result every time, to be honest.
Yeah.
Ask it a little differently and you'll get a lot different answers. Training seems to be really critical, and it is, like I said, an understanding what we do in with the results that we get,
Hmm.
and really the biases that come out of
Hmm.
it. I think it is really easy for us to lose sight of where biases might come into the data, and just ensuring that everyone understands that those exist.
Yeah, for sure. Is there anything else that we didn't cover? We had a lot of things on our list today to get through, but I know there's so much more. Is there anything else that you want to make sure gets covered?
I think we've done everything. I think we've hit privacy, the security threats. We didn't say that specifically, but that's implied in where we're putting these our details into any generative tools. I know in that cybersecurity element, they being aware of how you might be able to encrypt data that you're putting in. There,
Mm,
those things exist, but
hmm.
um just
Definitely.
really making yourself as much aware as what what you want to use the AI for,
Mhm.
and working with your team to make this make sense for you within the rules that you have within your organization.
Perfect. Well, I definitely don't think this is the end of this conversation. We're going to have many, many more. But thank you so much for joining us and getting us started on this journey today.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this topic, please let us know. Like, subscribe, or reach out to us at info@cit-net.com or head out to our website, cit-net.com/podcast. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode.